Walleye rigs can be as simple as you want them to be, but sometimes it takes a little something extra to trigger a fish to bite. And when that's the case, there are some small adjustments you can make to turn a tough day into a memorable day and maybe catch, more than your buddies. The key is understanding what adjustments to make and, more importantly, why those adjustments work, so that instead of guessing, you can make some more educated decisions and dial in on that bite quicker and faster, which leads to more catches throughout the day. Oh, and by the way, if you want to learn how to tie these rigs, I already made a video on that. You can use the card on this video somewhere to watch that if you're watching on a phone or a laptop, or you can just check the link in the description. Also note that in this video, I'm primarily talking about pulling bottom bouncers, but a lot of this stuff is pretty similar for Lindy rigs. So if you're using a Lindy setup, some of this will apply, some of it may need to be tweaked a little bit, but bottom bouncers, that's mostly what we're talking about. And what's usually the topic of discussion when most people are talking about walleye rigs? Well, they're talking about what? Leader length, right? Color of blades they're using, maybe the number of beads, maybe the type of hook, octopus hook versus slow death hook, whatever it is. They're probably also talking about how fast they're going in their boat, what their trolling speed is, which isn't tied into the rig itself, but obviously it matters. The real question though, like I said earlier, is why do these things matter? Perhaps the length of the leader itself physically matters if you're talking about like super clear water and super spooky fish and you want to hide your setup. But what if it's a situation where the fish aren't very line shy, like Sakakawea, for example, or maybe it's just so stained that they can't really see any of that stuff anyway? Does your leader length still matter in those cases? The answer, of course, is yes, or I wouldn't be bringing it up, but it's probably, in my opinion, for a different reason. I think the biggest thing that leader length does or changes is where your bait is positioned in the water column, because as you're pulling a rig through the water, you probably have some kind of blade on there, or whatever you have on there has some level of resistance, and with that resistance, it's going to tend to rise as you troll forward and pull that thing through the water. And there are a handful of other variables that can affect that too, like what type of line you're using. For example, monofilament line floats more than, say, fluorocarbon line, so that's going to ride higher. Maybe you're actually putting a bait float on your rig specifically. Some folks even use like worm blowers and stuff like that to squeeze some air into the worms to get them to rise higher. Like I said before, also the speed that you're trolling matters. The faster you troll, the more resistance, the more lift that you get, and the higher the water column your bait goes. So why does all this matter? Well, depending on the fish's mood, they tend to either ride closer to the bottom or higher up in the water column when they're chasing food. Typically walleyes, since their eyes are positioned slightly on the top of their head, like to feed upwards a little bit. But if the fish are very off, very pancaked to the bottom, very flat, they might not do that. In that case, keeping it very tight to the bottom can be helpful. And something like a Lindy rig can be really good in that scenario because those typically kind of just drag on the bottom itself. Also think about situations where maybe you're in super, super shallow water. Like maybe it is a spinner bite already, but you're fishing for fish in 3, 4, 5, 6 feet of water, something like that. If you have a 6-foot leader and you got a blade and that thing's lifting way, way up, there's a pretty good chance you could probably see your bait in the water right underneath the boat, and that's not likely to trigger a walleye to bite. If they can see you and your boat, pretty small chance you're gonna get bit unless you're pitching away from the boat in that scenario. But if it's a spinner bite, shallow water, shortening those leaders can actually keep the bait down further, more into the strike zone where those fish are actually comfortable to come up to it and take a look at it. And how short are we talking? Well, a lot of people like in the clear water situation might use leaders 6, 8, 10 feet long, something like that, to really hide their weight or whatever their bottom bouncer, etc. But in super shallow water, I've actually used leaders as short as 20 to 24 inches pulling through that stuff with great success, mostly because it just doesn't get it up that high to where they're less likely to come way out of the strike zone to where a human can see them, versus caring about that weight or that bottom bouncer under the water. And that's kind of the theme of this video, again, is going back to why these things work. So the leader length thing could work because it hides your weight system, or it could work just because it changes where things are presented in the water. So you can kind of take that idea of why these things work and maybe think about it a little differently with some other concepts. So if we go back to blades for a minute, the most popular thing a lot of people talk about with blades is what color are you using? Maybe what type. Is it a traditional blade? Is it a prop? Is it a butterfly? Something like that. And certainly color does matter. A lot of times matching the hatch, matching the forage can be a big thing in a system. Sometimes making it stand out is better. Sometimes you want to play to things like the brightness of the sun on that day. Super bright sunny days might be good with like gold or orange, and on cloudy days maybe purples or dark colors might work better. There's also a factor that a lot of people might not know, and that's the fact that there are certain colors that can only be seen down in the water so far. So for example, the warmer colors, the reds and stuff like that, those actually disappear pretty quickly. So for example, red can only be seen about 15 foot down under the water. So if you're using a red blade, bead, whatever it is, and the fish is in 20 feet, they probably can't even see it. They might see a silhouette or a shadow, but they're not seeing the color itself. So if your goal is to get them to see the color, it's not working. On the other hand, the cooler colors, stuff like blue, for example, can be seen all the way down to like 75 or maybe more than 100 feet. So if you're fishing for walleyes super deep, 30, 40, 50 feet, blue and purple are often great color choices if you want them to see the color, if that's the goal, to get them attracted to the color. But if we drill down a little further and continue on with this why theme, there's another reason why blades work. Part of it is sight and color, but they also create a vibration in the water, right? Fish have lateral lines and they can feel vibrations, and oftentimes I think fish feed maybe more by vibration feeling than they do by actual sight, especially if you got super dark, murky water. So in this case, you might actually notice that the color doesn't matter a whole lot, but the size of the blade does. A bigger blade is gonna put out more thump and more vibration, and a smaller one's gonna put out less. And sometimes those are good things or bad things. If fish are not super aggressive and maybe a little spooky, actually a little amount of vibration might be the right amount. Whereas if they're very aggressive and they're very not spooky, I guess, then a bigger blade might actually help them find it better, especially in darker water, and it might actually, so a lot of times I'll play with different blade sizes as opposed to colors, especially if there doesn't seem to be a theme with the color that given day. And I've also tended to notice that bigger blades with more vibration often catch bigger fish too. So it probably, to me, indicates more vibration is a bigger bait and a bigger meal that fish are chasing. So if a smaller fish is tuned into a certain amount of vibration, a bigger fish might be feeling for, listening for a bigger vibrating thing that it wants to hunt down to eat. So while you can certainly just use the old trial and error method and just keep throwing different stuff down there, changing things at random until you figure out what the fish bite, these are just some things that I've learned over the last few years with a little more experience that seem to indicate that there was some sort of underlying reason why some of these seemingly random things work better versus others. And as I put some of those patterns together, it's helped me get on bites quicker, pattern fish quicker, and that's what I'm trying to help you all do with this video. But aside from that, if you just want some quick tips, there are some other things that I've learned that are maybe a little less thinking heavy, but just nice little tricks to have in the back of your mind to also try while you're out on the water that makes your life easier while you're fishing with walleye rigs. First of all, as I talked about earlier, the type of line you use matters. Monofilament line does float more and fluorocarbon line does sink more, but fluorocarbon is more abrasion resistant, so you might be less likely to get it broken off by a pike or less likely to get it scratched by rocks and break over time. But if you're gonna fish with it, the key is you typically have to fish a bottom that's pretty clean, like a sand flat, something like that. If you're doing that and the line's dragging on the bottom, it's not that big a deal. If you're fishing something with a lot of garbage on the bottom, like we do a lot of times in Sakakawea, maybe you got some tree stumps down there, maybe you got some rocks down there, any other garbage like that, fluorocarbon's not gonna work so well. You're just gonna get hung up all the time. So even though it's abrasion resistant to scratching, if the hook gets caught in the rock and you can't get it out, it doesn't really matter anymore, does it? Also, if you've done a lot of walleye fishing with rigs, slow death hooks are probably not new to you, but if you haven't tried a slow death rig, that's another thing you can think about. It's a slightly different shaped hook that makes the bait kind of corkscrew in the water, gives it a little different action. And a lot of times, whether it's a slower bite day that might help trigger it, or just something different to put down in the water, so you've got a couple different things going, it gives a slightly different action, might trigger more bites or less bites on certain given days, but it's another thing to try. And if you're getting a lot of missed bites, a lot of short bites, you're not getting hooked up very well, and you reel up and you got half a night crawler left, one thing that I've learned, especially when fish get a little finicky, and especially if they're smaller fish, more of your eater sized fish, it doesn't seem like they want to get too close to the blade. They seem to like to trail the blade at a certain distance, and they're gonna try to bite the bait without hitting the blade. Something is attracting about the blade, but it's also off-putting. So the more that you can space that out, put a bunch more beads in there, whatever the case is, find a way to get that blade a little bit forward. That can often help with your hookup ratios. Or You can also use a double hook harness if you're pulling night crawlers, or you could even put a stinger hook on a minnow, but having an extra hook back there might help your hookup ratios as well. Hopefully some of those tips were helpful, and if they were, I'd appreciate it if you hit the button to say so, because that'll help me help other people in the long run, because more people will find this video and perhaps subscribe to the channel. So thanks for those of you that do, and if you haven't yet, think about doing that. But again, the key point to this is always understanding the why. So like on the best of days, anything you throw down there can work. But if a fish get a little tight-lipped, and maybe you've been one of those people that is fishing in a group of boats and they're catching 10 fish to your 1 or 2, and you're like, something's clearly different here. Understanding why these different adjustments work can help you dial that in quicker so that you're not the person that's getting outfished the next time you're out with your buddies in a tournament or just trying to have a good time with your family. So go make yourself some walleye rigs, check out the other video. If you don't know how to make the rigs yet yourself, of course you can buy them in the store, but it's a lot more fun to make them. Maybe you can have a good family bonding time making some rigs together. That's what we used to do with my dad and my brothers. We had rig making parties before fishing trips. It was great. Try that out. And hopefully catch some more fish on your next time out. Thanks for watching, fisher people. How to more quickly track. There's a pro tip. That seemed to indicate that there were things that mattered that I wasn't. That doesn't make any sense.